It was many years ago, on a day when the sun felt close enough to touch the earth. The man had finished his work in the city and was riding his bicycle back to the village, following the same narrow road he had known since childhood. It was around 1 in the afternoon, the hour when even the wind prefers to stay still. The sky was a hard, blinding white. Heat shimmered over the asphalt like a restless mirage, blurring the line between what was real and what only seemed to be. The fields on either side of the road lay silent and empty, drained of all color. Trees stood motionless, their shadows thin and sharp like black knives on the ground. There was no one else on the road. No people. No animals. No cars in the distance, only the steady clink of his bicycle chain, repeating the same metallic rhythm, echoing strangely loud in the stillness. In that unnatural quiet, even the smallest sound felt wrong, as if he was disturbing something that preferred not to be disturbed. He wiped the sweat from his face with the back of his hand and glanced at the horizon. Home was still some distance away, and between him and his village lay the oldest landmark he knew, the graveyard that watched over the entrance to the village. As he rode further, the silence deepened into something heavier, almost physical. The world felt drained, as if sound itself had been pulled away. The usual noises of midday, distant voices, the barking of dogs, the hum of traffic, were simply gone. It wasn't only that no one was there, it was the feeling that no one should be there. The man shifted his weight on the pedals, his legs already tired from the heat and the distance. The bicycle rattled slightly over a rough patch of road, and the faint clatter echoed unnaturally far, as though the road were a hollow shell. Even his breathing, quiet and controlled, seemed too loud. He glanced to the left and right, hoping to see a bird, a stray dog, even a stray plastic bag caught in a bush. Anything that would prove the world was still alive. But there was nothing. The fields lay open and exposed, the air heavy and unmoving, the distant tree line standing like a black border under the scorched sky. For a brief moment, he felt as though he weren't riding through the world he knew, but through some empty version of it. A shell, a copy, a place abandoned in a hurry. Ahead, the outline of the graveyard grew clearer. Old, crooked gravestones, a leaning boundary wall, and a few twisted trees that had seen more burials than living visitors. The graveyard came into full view as he approached, a stretch of uneven ground dotted with leaning headstones, some broken, some half-buried, all of them old. A few gnarled trees stood among them, their branches tangled like the fingers of something reaching up from below. He had passed this place countless times before. As a child, he had been warned not to linger there after dark, not to play near its walls, not to speak too loudly while passing. It was the kind of warning children receive so often that it begins to feel like superstition. As he grew older, he learned to laugh at those old fears, but he never fully forgot them. In the blazing daylight, the graveyard should have looked harmless. Just another piece of land, another patch of earth where time did what it always does. But today it felt different. The quiet here seemed deeper. The shadows under the trees seemed darker than they should have been at noon. As the man drew closer, he shifted his gaze back to the road. The quickest way home was straight ahead, past the graveyard and into the village beyond. The sooner he crossed this stretch, the sooner the weight in his chest might lift. He leaned forward slightly and tightened his grip on the handlebars, his focus narrowing to the strip of road that cut between the graveyard and the living world. It was as he reached the middle of the graveyard stretch that he saw her. At first, she was only a shape in the heat, a dark outline moving slowly along the side of the road. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into the figure of an old woman walking ahead of him. She was dressed entirely in black, a long, loose garment that hung straight down to her ankles, sleeves covering her arms, fabric absorbing the sun's fury. Her head was slightly bowed, and a dark cloth covered her hair. He couldn't see her face. From his angle, all he could see was the narrow frame of her shoulders and the curve of her back. In that empty, scorching stretch, the sight of another human being should have been comforting. Instead, it felt wrong. There was no reason for someone her age to be walking alone in this heat, on this deserted road, with the graveyard on one side and empty fields on the other. As he approached from behind, he heard no footsteps from her, no rustle of fabric, no small cough or sigh. She was simply there, a black shape moving slowly ahead of him as the sound of his bicycle chain echoed between the silent graves. Whether out of habit, courtesy, or something like pity, he eased his pace and prepared to pass her. That was when she lifted her arm and made a small, simple gesture with her hand, a beckoning motion, without turning her head. He hesitated for a moment. Logic and something like compassion argued quickly in his mind. It was too hot for a woman of her age to be walking alone. The village was still some distance away. Even if she had started from there, where had she been? And why was she returning now, under this merciless sun? But the thought passed almost as quickly as it came. This was not the place or time to analyze the choices of a stranger. She had raised her hand. She needed help. And he, alone on the road with a bicycle, was the only help available. He steered gently toward the side of the road and pressed the brakes. The bicycle slowed, then rolled to a stop a few steps ahead of her. The air felt heavier the moment he stopped moving, as if the wind he created while riding had been the only thing keeping the heat from settling directly on his skin. Without saying a word, he shifted his weight, steadied the bicycle with one foot on the ground, and tilted his head slightly to indicate she could climb on. He expected to hear the soft sounds of her approach, the shuffle of old feet over dust, the rustle of fabric. Instead, there was only the faint creak of the bicycle frame and the distant hollow echo of the chain as the wheels spun slowly in place. Then he felt it, a subtle downward pull at the back of the bicycle, a weight settling onto the rear carrier. He swallowed once, his throat suddenly dry, and placed both feet back on the pedals. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The bicycle moved, the pedals turned, and the road began to slide under him once again. But within a few seconds, he noticed a difference. The bicycle felt heavier. He pressed down on the pedals, expecting the familiar resistance, the easy roll of the tires. Instead, it felt as if someone had quietly placed a load on the back. A sack of grain, a crate of stones. Not enough to stop him, but enough to force his legs to work harder. He tried to dismiss it as his imagination, or the sudden fatigue from stopping and starting again in this furnace of a day. The air felt thicker, harder to pull into his lungs. Sweat stung his eyes and slid down his neck, soaking the collar of his shirt. But the weight kept growing. Each stroke of the pedal seemed to demand more strength than the last. His breathing became louder in his ears, each inhale rougher than the one before. The road, which had always been a gentle, familiar path, now felt like a slow, relentless climb. The graveyard still stretched alongside them, row after row of silent stones watching. The trees cast darker shadows now, as if the sun were no longer reaching this part of the earth. The man narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, focusing everything on the movement of his legs. The bicycle groaned faintly under the strain. His calves burned, his chest ached, and yet, the weight on the back did not feel like the weight of a small, fragile old woman. It felt like something else entirely. His breathing became ragged, no longer matching the calm rhythm he prided himself on. He was not a weak man. He knew this road, this distance, this heat. He had ridden it before, with loads heavier than an elderly passenger, and had never felt this kind of exhaustion so quickly. Something was wrong. The thought formed quietly, like a small cold stone dropping into his stomach. The air around him felt different now. Not just hot, but thick, as if he were pushing through invisible water. The silence that had once seemed empty now felt crowded, full of something unspeaking, unseen. A moment passed, then another. The weight on the rear of the bicycle seemed to grow heavier still, pressing down not only on the metal frame, but on his nerves and his thoughts. He became aware of the hairs on his arms and the back of his neck standing up, despite the heat. A slow, crawling discomfort began to move along his spine. He realized that since the woman had climbed on, he had not heard a single sound from her. No shift of her position, no exhale, no cough, no slightest rustle of cloth. She was behind him, close enough to touch, and yet, in every sense except the drag on the bicycle, she was absent. A simple, inevitable idea rose through his mind. He tried to ignore it, but could not. He needed to look back. He needed to see her. He turned his head. The movement felt slow and heavy, as if the air itself were resisting it. For a heartbeat, his eyes were filled only with the blur of heat and shadow behind him. Then the image sharpened, and his mind struggled to accept what it was seeing. The old woman in black was gone. In her place sat something twisted, something wrong. A figure hunched on the rear of the bicycle, its body too large for its frame, its limbs long and tilted at unnatural angles. The black cloth clung to it like skin, stretching over shapes that did not belong to any human. Her face, if it could still be called a face, was turned directly toward him. The features were distorted, the mouth stretched too wide, lips pulling back to reveal teeth that seemed too many, too sharp. The eyes were open far too wide, dark and gleaming, fixed on him with a terrible, delighted focus. She was smiling. Her shoulders shook with a soundless laugh for a moment. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the sound arrived, tearing through the heavy silence. A dry, ragged, inhuman laughter burst out behind him, louder than the cicadas, louder than the wind, louder than his own panicked heartbeat. It seemed to fill the road, the graveyard, the sky above them. For an instant he could not move. His hands locked on the handlebars. His legs froze on the pedals. The bicycle wobbled under them, the weight on the back as heavy as iron. The spell broke all at once. Instinct took over where thought failed. He tore his gaze away from the thing behind him and forced his legs to move. The bicycle lurched, then caught its balance. Every muscle in his body burned as he drove the pedals down, over and over, as if sheer speed might tear him away from whatever clung to the back. The laughter did not stop. It rose and fell in jagged, unnatural waves, crashing against his ears, digging under his skin. It sounded close and far at the same time, as though it were coming from directly behind him, and from every grave in the graveyard at once. He did not dare look back again. He fixed his eyes on the road, on the thin line that marked the end of the graveyard stretch. The bicycle felt impossibly heavy, but it moved. Slowly, then faster. His lungs burned, his vision blurred at the edges, but the strip of road remaining beside the graves grew shorter with each tortured second. Finally, the last of the leaning headstones fell behind them. The boundary wall ended. The graveyard slipped from his peripheral vision. Ahead, the path opened into familiar fields and the beginning of the village's outskirts. The laughter cut off, not gradually, not fading into the distance. It stopped as suddenly as a door slamming shut. The weight on the rear of the bicycle vanished. The frame rose slightly, freed. The air felt lighter. The sounds of the world returned. Distant insects, a faint breeze moving through the crops, the rhythm of his own breath. He did not stop riding until the village houses were in sight. He reached the village with shaking legs and a heart that refused to slow down, even long after he had stopped pedaling. He told no one what had happened that day. What words could he have used? How could he have described the weight, the silence, the smile that did not belong to anything human? Yet, the memory did not fade. It clung to him as faithfully as his own shadow. In the years that followed, whenever he had to travel to the city, he chose different routes, longer ways, less familiar roads, anything to avoid the stretch that passed by the old graveyard. Sometimes, late at night, he heard the stories people told. Stories of things seen near that graveyard at odd hours, of shapes glimpsed at the edge of vision, of laughter heard where no one stood. He listened without interrupting, saying nothing of his own experience. But on rare afternoons, when the heat rose just right and the cicadas went silent all at once, he would remember the feeling of the bicycle sinking under a weight that did not belong to this world. He would remember the way the air had felt thick and wrong, the way the sun had seemed powerless to touch the shadows between the graves. And above all, he would remember the face that turned toward him on that empty road. The warped, delighted smile of something that had worn an old woman's form like a mask, if only for a moment. Whether anyone believed in such things or not did not matter to him. He had seen her. He had carried her past the graves. And he would never, for the rest of his life, forget the laughter of the woman in black.